I could just add an object and boom, it was there. Like I could add a field to an object and add it to the page layout and I was done. Like I didn't have to do all these crazy things on the AS400. So I just fell in love with it.
That is Daniel Hoechst, a Salesforce Architect at Instructure. I'm Josh Birk, a developer evangelist at Salesforce, and here on the Salesforce Developer Podcast, you'll hear stories and insights from developers for developers. Today, we sit down to talk to Daniel about his experiences on the platform, as well as a specific project of his to help monitor limits. That quote was about him first encountering Salesforce, a platform he approaches from the perspective of an MBA.
Well, you learn everything in an MBA, such as how finances and accounting practices work to how to manage people. So, having that background has really helped me understand what the business is asking for rather than just coming at it from a technical background. So, I feel like I have a better idea of like why they're asking for something, and I can provide a lot more value beyond just giving them a technical solution. I always ask why. I say like, why are you trying to build that thing? What are you trying to do? Because often, so many people come to you with a technical solution. They're like, I need an object that has 20 fields and I need this automation to happen. And you have to back them up a little bit and go, well, wait, why? What are you trying to do? And oftentimes we find that there's some other solution that's really going to solve the business need better. It helps them, get away from these weird technical solutions that they come up with themselves.
Now, Daniel actually entered the world of software before getting his MBA, and that led to his introduction to Salesforce in a role that's becoming something of a theme on the podcast. He started working customer service.
I actually entered the software world before I got my MBA. Many, many years ago. I've actually lived in Utah now for 20 years. And when I first got here, I actually started working in customer service at a outdoor products manufacturer called Petzl. And I was just working customer service. I have a civil engineering degree, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do with myself. So out of college, I moved out west from Georgia and ended up working customer service. Well, while I was there, they had just implemented a new ERP that was AS400 and nobody knew how it worked. So I started reading the manual and started making suggestions on how we could improve things. And finally, IT got annoyed enough that they said, come work for us. So I got a job as a developer on the IT team helping support the ERP. I spent quite a few years building green screen applications to support that. And eventually we found Salesforce and implemented it for sales.
Fast forward to his current role where he's in a large org with a lot of different moving parts. And I think a lot of people listening probably are familiar with what happens when one of those gears can bring down the entire machine.
Well, so we run a pretty large Salesforce org here. Like I mentioned, we have users across all the clouds pretty much. And we have been around for 10 years on the Salesforce platform the company has, with a lot of different admins, a lot of different developers. There's a lot of things going on. We have, something like 30 or 40 managed packages. Some of those are big ones like Financial Force PSA, Salesforce CPQ, and others. And they all sometimes interact with each other in odd ways. And, we have our own code too. So we actually got hit a few times. Right when I started, my boss, when I came on, he was super gun shy about applications connecting to the API because we had a vendor who had connected to our API and brought the org down because it used up all our API calls. So that was one example. We had other products that were just causing loops. Maybe one managed package or something we wrote was causing a loop to hit and causing other things to happen. So, we were hitting limits. And in a few occasions, we actually had to frantically call up Premier support and ask them to increase some limit, whether it be our API limit, probably the number of email messages that get sent by Apex. That's another limit we've hit. And we hit it a few too many times. And I got frustrated and said, there's got to be a better way to watch for this. So I kind of sat down and looked at the documentation and said, hey, there's actually an API endpoint to get the limits, the org limits. I'm not looking at the transaction limits, the number of execution time and that kind of thing. I'm more interested in 24-hour limits, like the things that if you hit those, your org is in trouble. And said, hey, you know what? It's possible. I think I can do this.
And again, it only really takes one gear to be a bad operator in order to kind of gum up the whole works. And sometimes it's going against Apex, maybe it's going against APIs, which thankfully is getting something of a relief.
Right, exactly. Yeah, like the API is a good example. If people are connecting to the traditional API, SOAP API, you can't really put them in a little box and say, hey, you can only have 10% of our API. And if you go above that, you're just going to stop working, which would be wonderful. But, instead, one application can run away with your limits, especially with your API calls. Now, fortunately, I'm talking about API calls because that was what our problem has often been. I'm happy to see in the spring release notes that it's now going to be a soft limit. So if you go over it, your org can still continue to run. But I still think it's important to watch those limits, because even if you have something that's going to run away, if you have something that's hitting your API and doing something is wrong, and you need to be alerted to it.
Now, these bad operators, they might not be built with bad intentions, but they might be coming out from the perspective of something that's an easy pitfall for developing with Salesforce, and that is not developing to scale.
Sometimes I think it kind of has to do with data volume. I think, like I said, we have a big org. We have a pretty big data volume. And I think some of the smaller vendors out there that have written apps for Salesforce haven't considered companies with such large volumes of data. And, they may have had something that's, let's say they're syncing contacts, from Salesforce to some other application. And they didn't implement a diff. They're just going in and just grabbing every single time it connects. It goes, I'm going to get all your contacts and I'm going to copy them over. I'm not going to look for last modified date or anything like that. So just poor design. Like, people aren't really thinking about, when I get into a larger scale of data, I need to start thinking about, well, okay, don't pull everything. Let's use some of the newer features of the platform. You could use the last modified date, but there's even better features now, like change data capture and some of these other things that could be used to really identify specific changes without having to go and just search through the entire org to look for records that have changed.
Okay, so anecdote time. I was once an innocent developer on a project for a very large media company, and we kept asking them for a data set that was representative of their production data so that we could code to scale. And they first gave us a few hundred rows of data, which we didn't believe. And so we kept asking, well, what's something that's more representative? And they eventually gave us one that was closer to 50,000 rows of data, which we thought was pretty plausible, only to go to production and find out that it was more like 500,000 rows of data. Needless to say, there was some performance changes that needed to be applied after that. So if you're on a project that has large data volumes, make sure that is getting flagged correctly to your developer. Now, moving on from things like API calls and data volume, what are some other pitfalls that we can look for, but also potentially avoid in an application?
Things such as storage usage. And as I mentioned, the email sent from Apex is an odd one because many of your limits will increase based on the number of users that you have in the system. The email one does not. I want to say it's 2,000 emails in a 24-hour period. It might be higher. There's different, depending on which org edition you're on, but it doesn't increase. So, if you have 1,000 users or you have 100 users, it's the same limit. So that's one that you have to really be careful of, because it's one that doesn't scale with the number of users that you have. And we have some code that sends emails from cases, and we have gotten into a situation where there's a loop. We try to avoid sending emails through Apex at all, but there's a few edge cases that we had to do it. We try to send them with workflow rules or process builder because the number of emails you can send with those is astronomical. It's like hundreds of thousands, if not millions. But if you wanted to send an attachment, you can't send an email with an attachment through workflow or process builder. And so if we needed to send an attachment that's dynamic, we have to use some Apex for that. So we've had a situation where we had basically we had a loop where the recipient on the other end was replying something, but was replying with an attachment. And then that would come back into Salesforce as an attachment. And then our Apex would be like, I need to email this attachment out to all the case contacts. And it just was looping. And so that was a bug that we identified in our code through monitoring our limits, because we were like, hey, there's something happening, and we could actually see it and identify the case before it took the entire org down.
Let's shift away from problems and over to solutions, because Daniel has a project up on GitHub for an application that runs on the platform that helps you monitor these limits and then send out warnings if you're getting close to them.
So how I've configured it is actually, the nice thing, I was surprised as I built this app was that the amount of actual code that I used is maybe about 20 or 30 lines of code. That's about it. The rest of it is all using platform stuff like, objects and process builder. And, I don't think I even have any flow in there, but process builder. So the idea is you can configure each limit. So I've provided instructions on my GitHub of how to initialize the app. So basically you can run a little bit of Apex Anonymous where it just goes and does a list of all the limits that are available to be monitored and inserts records. So we have basically a header level record of your limit. So you'd have a header level of Apex emails, you'd have a header level of API, data storage, etc. And then we can configure each of those limits to be monitored at increments up. Right now I do increments up to 15 minutes. So you can do 15-minute intervals. So every 15 minutes, the scheduled job runs and says, I need to pull a snapshot for this limit. And if it does, then it will pull a snapshot and records it as a child object to that limit. So basically you just have a limit and snapshots, and it just runs on that schedule. And then we can configure for each limit, what are my thresholds? So there's several thresholds that you might want to watch when limits are considered. One is just percent of total. So let's say I'll use data storage. Let's say your data storage, you're in a developer edition, so your data storage is 10 megs. So if you are using, let's say you're using 8 megs, you're at 80% of data storage. That might be the time you want to start showing a limit, telling the admin team that you're getting close to hitting that limit. So I've got it configurable at that limit that says for data storage, notify me when I'm at 80% of the limit. And so everything will hum along fine until we hit that limit. So that's one way we monitor it. Another way that I look at, which can also identify problems, is if there's a big increase suddenly. So in that case, let's say I'll use data storage again. Let's say you've been humming along and you just got a couple of megs of data, and then all of a sudden it pops to 9 megs, right? Or let's say 7, so we don't go over the 80%. So if you're humming along at 2 megs and it pops to 7 megs, that's a pretty big increase percentage-wise. And so we can configure that as well. And I by default, I put it as if there's anything that's a 20% increase between snapshots, that's something to be concerned with. And you can configure that per limit to say, for data storage, I might be more concerned if it increases 5%, right? If you have a big org. So we can look at it in a couple of different ways to watch for those problems.
Now, when Daniel first started tinkering around with this, the objects that we're talking about for the limits were API only. And so he actually put together a quick MVP using Boomi that would go after the API and then send out the emails. And well, it worked more or less.
PagerDuty can send texts and emails and phone calls, and it can wake you up. That's great. We find it, we address the limit. But let's say we'll get back to the email one because we've been talking about that a lot. Let's say you got close. Let's say you're at 1,500 out of 2,000 emails. And that's perilously close, but we caught the problem and fixed it. We're going to still be at that limit for another 24 hours or so because it's a rolling 24-hour period. And so if I have that threshold of 80% or whatever, somebody's going to get woken up every time the limit process runs and goes, hey, you're still over this threshold. Wake up, wake up. And so that was a problem. And I had some people not so happy with me. So, I started thinking about it. And also it was kind of an MVP product. I had hard coded most of the thresholds and other things. And I realized I wanted to have, some flexibility. So I wanted to be able to change it per limit to monitor different levels. And I wanted to have some kind of a snooze functionality so that if we do go over a limit, we can snooze it for a certain period of time and say, all right, we've hit the limit. We know what's happening. We're going to snooze it now. So for the next 24 hours, instead of 80%, make it 90%. And that way it can still be monitoring. So if you have another spike that causes a problem, great. But as long as you stay below 90 for the next 8 hours or whatever you've set, then it won't send any alerts again. So those were kind of the things that I said. Now that I have had some experience with this and found the problems, the things that I'd like to improve, I said, I can build this on the Salesforce platform.
Daniel's code is all up on GitHub, all open source, and it's also a great example of a dependent package because it's also dependent on his own test factory project, which in itself is a great example of open source because it's loosely based on an older project.
Matthew Botos from Maven's Consulting built another test factory I believe it's called Smart Factory. And it had a big following. This was, I want to say 7 years ago. And people really liked it. And, the nice thing about a test factory is you can have predictable objects, records and that kind of thing. And so what Smart Factory did was it used describes to look at your data, at your object, and say, oh, well, that's a Boolean. I'm going to put a checkbox. I'm going to put a yes in there. That's a text field. I'm going to throw a random text value in it. So basically, that Smart Factory, just you said, I want an account, and it would go look at the account object and fill in all of the fields with just random values for the most part. And it worked. And, it was nice because for a developer, if you had something that was a required field, it would put something in it. You wouldn't have to worry about that. But what I didn't like was the randomness. I didn't like that it would just put random data in to all these fields because I felt like that could give you unpredictable test results. You go run your test once and just something about the random data that gets put in there might cause your test to fail the next time you run it and nothing happens. So I wanted a little more control over what the values were in there. So I ended up writing my own kind of model a little bit about like his interfaces. So I borrowed from his stuff, like how he was generating the S object. The interface is almost the same. But behind the scenes, instead of it doing random, you provide templates and you say, okay, my template for account is account name has value XYZ company, and it's so every time you ask for an account, it always has that value.
Now, more specifically, these packages aren't just dependent. They're unlocked packages as Daniel has moved them to that particular SFDX format. Now, I did ask Daniel about his favorite non-technical hobby. As it turns out, it dovetails right into a community event that occurred just recently.
I spend a lot of time out in the snow. One of the reasons, well, it's not one of the reasons I moved to Utah, but it's definitely one of the reasons I stay here. I tell you, I love playing in the outdoors so much. We organized Snowforce here in Salt Lake City. And that was really an excuse for me to go skiing. So that has been fun to see grow, and I still get to go skiing. So I think this podcast will probably air after Snowforce this year. But yeah, in February, we'll have Snowforce again. And that's a day of Salesforce community sessions and a day of skiing. So that's what I love doing. Snowforce let me combine the two hobbies. So
So if you like skiing in Salesforce, head on over to Snowforce. Check it out in 2021. I want to give a thanks to Daniel for the great conversation and some of the great code that he has put out there on GitHub. Thanks to you for listening. If you would like to learn more about this show, head on over to developer.salesforce.com/podcast, where you can see show notes, old episodes, and also links to your favorite podcast services. I'll talk to you next week.